Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with New Role, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to your channel of choice. I'm your host, Ollie Cummings, CEO of New Role, the board-level hiring platform that specializes in the high-value placements that drive high-impact boards. Today, I'm talking to Graham Hobson, a developer by background who has since co-founded printing and personalization business PhotoBox.com. Graham's a coach and advisor and board member for a number of startups and SMEs, and also has a number of roles in the pro bono and volunteer space. Today, we're going to be talking about fundraising, successful exits, and more. Graham, welcome to the show. Delighted to be able to get you on, and would love to hear, first of all, just a bit about your story.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Ollie. I'm delighted to be here. So my story, I'll kind of start small and zoom out as needed. But I had a background in technology. I did a degree in computer science at university, and ended up working for investment banks for about 14 years in various jobs. And that was all fine. It's a well-paid career, and I got lots of experience and made some good contacts. But in my mid 30s, when I had two small children at the time, I needed a service, which was we would take lots of pictures of our two young kids, and I'd go off to Boots every couple of weeks with a roll of film and bring back the results. And it occurred to me that we were not getting great quality with the pictures. We would take so many random pictures, and only a few of them would be the ones that we'd really treasure. And I was thinking, being a techie and prone to buying gadgets, maybe I should buy a decent digital camera and go that route. So I did that, and showed my wife, pictures on the computer screen, and they looked amazing compared to our film camera. But there was just nowhere to get prints, nowhere online, and nowhere on the high street. And the only solution available to people at the time who wanted to print digital pictures was to use an inkjet printer. And you're probably too young, Ollie, to remember those, but it was kind of like 3D printing 1.0, and you had this very long and laborious process. And then whenever you went to do it, you'd realize you were out of ink cartridges, and everything was kind of streaky. And anyway, it's not a good experience. So I thought,
You're making me feel old. I still have my inkjet printer.
Okay. Well, it just occurred to me that there had to be a better way. And I thought, this is crazy, like, to get digital prints from a camera is effectively something that only needs three components. It needs a website, some kind of order management system, and one of those big fat printers you see in the back of every boot store. So I guess on my journey into work over a couple of weeks, I wrote what was the outline of a business plan of what would a service to do this look like, how would I raise money, how would I get people to become aware of it. To be clear, I'd never created a business before, never managed other people, but it felt to me like an interesting thought experiment and an interesting idea. And this was late 1999, and there was an absolute bubble going on in the internet sector, and everybody was keen to create a website. And I mentioned it to a couple of people at work, and they said, wow, that sounds great. Like, if you go ahead and do it, we'll back you. So I found myself at the end of 99 having written a business plan, had commitment from people to invest in it, managed eventually to rope in a friend as a co-founder, and on the brink of starting this company, which was PhotoBox. And to kind of skim over the next bit, it was a very slow and hard process that took many years to get us to any kind of decent scale. And I realized that I did lots of things wrong during those first 6 years. We effectively ended up with a small business that was growing slowly, and that was not the big internet dream that I started out with.
Tell me more about that. What were the things that you realized that you'd done wrong at that point?
Well, first of all, I think, I had a huge amount to learn. And like I said, I'd never run a business before, never managed other people. But there were a lot of external factors that I think influenced us in the routes we took. First of all, we launched in May 2000. I do remember that our first customer that I didn't know, some random guy came on, uploaded photos, ordered them. It was a £2.80 order, and in fact that was the only order that day. But we launched in May, and then a couple of weeks later there was this almighty crash in the Nasdaq, and people decided that the internet bubble was over, and whilst this internet thing might be a great idea, it's never going to deliver on the promise that the investment markets were expecting, and funding just disappeared, and we had burnt our way through 2/3 of £500,000 in getting to the point of launching, which sounds like a lot of money, but you have to remember at the time we launched, hardware was expensive. It cost us 10 grand just to buy something that could store a few thousand photos. Where there was no AWS, we had to buy all our own servers. There was no SaaS solutions. Everything we had to build from scratch. So we burnt through money very quickly. We'd always intended to raise more money in the summer of 2000, and suddenly that door had closed. And so my co-founder and I, Mark, we were both quite conservative by nature, and we were saying, okay, this is not good. Let's effectively go into hibernation mode, but try and raise more money. And we had a good plan to raise money, but that fell through at the last minute. So we ended up surviving off a very small rights issue from our investors and running a small business. And I think the mistake was that a year later, we should have said, look, we've delivered on everything we wanted to. We've launched in the UK. We've got a credible, growing business. We're getting to meaningful revenues. We're probably market leader in the UK. We've seen off competition from amazingly people like Boots and some of the camera manufacturers. We should have been more bold then, gone out and raised money, but we didn't. We stuck with the slow organic growth, and that meant we were kind of locked into running a small business for several years, and those were very lean years. And my wife was very supportive, but also very patient. And I think probably about 5 years in, she said, "Kind of, what's the plan with this? Are we never going to go on a holiday again? Are we never going to have a family car again?" So it made me realize that we needed to change things up a bit.
Amazing. And talk me through, what was the kind of the advisory group that you had around you? And because I mean, you've been very modest, but I think it's reported that when you finally sort of exited, it was sort of 300, 400 million. So it was this amazing journey that you went through. But what did that advisory circle that you had around you look like? Because we see lots of organizations going through that journey, and one of the key questions they often have is, how should I build up my board, and how many people do I need at what different stages? What was your experience with that?
Well, I was amazingly lucky, and I think if there was one word that defines the experience of the first few years, it was serendipity. Like I said, I was very naive in many areas, but I knew that I needed support. And I probably didn't really understand what a board did or what it was for, but I knew I needed to have people around me. And kind of magically, they all fell into place. So the person I needed to help me with the finance side of things, the CFO kind of part-time role, was my wife's cousin's boyfriend at the time. And back in November '99, I went for breakfast with my wife in town and said one day, "Oh, I've got this idea for a business," and she was a bit bemused and said, "Well, don't give up your day job, but it sounds interesting." And I said, No, I have to give up my day job if I do this. But that night we went for dinner with her cousin in Fulham, and her cousin's boyfriend I thought he was an accountant for pubs, but it turned out that he was an experienced financier and had, in fact, even been a NASDAQ listed CFO at one point. And he said, "Come and tell me about this another day." And I did. And he said, "Well, look, I'll take a small slug of equity and I'll be your CFO and I'll help you put together the paperwork." And so that I had, an amazing advisor for the finance side. Similarly, I used to go to my dentist in my 20s and 30s, and he'd say, "Oh, you work in tech. My cousin runs PC World," and this was always the story with my dentist. And I thought, I know I know a lot about technology and I'm kind of figuring out the photographic piece, but I don't know anything about marketing. And it would be amazing if I had access to someone who'd run something like PC World, who knew about box shifting. Um, so I reached out to my dentist. He put me in touch with his cousin, and this chap came in, Colin Glass, as an amazing non-exec chairman and industry contacts advisor. So I was incredibly lucky with that. And the third area of expertise was I wrote to every pro lab in London. Pro labs were at the time big photographic houses that used to do fashion or advertising, and provide studios, processing, post production work, and two of them ended up engaging with us and talking to us, and one of them we ended up doing a kind of joint venture with, and they provided our photographic industry contacts and expertise. So I ended up with three amazing advisors without having to pay them salaries, but I had to give them some equity to do that.
Wow, brilliant. I mean, it's almost like you needed a platform to find those to avoid that serendipity at the time. If only we'd been around to help you.
If
I mean,
only.
that is obviously amazingly sort of fortuitous story, I suppose. Like, do you feel you had all bases covered between those three as you now think about it? And obviously, you're now looking at this from the other side of the table with your, when you're sitting there as a board member and thinking about what are those bases that founders need covered. Are those all the bases, or do you now? How do you now think about that?
Well, I think we had a lot of bases covered, and over time, I grew to appreciate what a board can add in terms of the structure and the prompting and the shoulder to cry on. So I think when we got stuck on things, I could reach out to a good group of people and get feedback. It didn't cover every base. We made lots of mistakes. I think operationally we were still very weak. For a long time it was just Mark and myself. We had one or two junior employees at times, but so a lot of the day to day, a board is never going to step in and do the day to day work for you. They're there to guide you strategically and for the big decisions, but not for the day to day stuff. So I think we were still very weak, particularly on marketing. And yeah, I think overall we could have been more ambitious and moved things along a bit faster. Although it felt like at the time we were a hostage to macro events going on.
Okay, interesting. I mean, we have advisory board members in place for product and engineering, sales. Like each of my sort of functional team leads have a advisory board member. We found that invaluable for sort of mentoring them, opening up the horizon. Obviously you had a tech background. Did you ever feel there were gaps on that front?
Well, I was determined that I was not going to be hands on with technology. I was going to direct it. I was going to definitely run the product role. And I think I didn't really understand what the product role was, but somehow I found myself in it, and I made good enough decisions that process worked. I was very lucky to have two guys called Chris I'd hired, one to build the website and one to build the internal production systems. And with our small team, we got a lot done, and ultimately I feel I made 6 out of 10 decisions correctly, 4 out of 10 wrong, but that was enough to keep us growing and moving us forward. So I think if we'd grown faster, we would have definitely needed to bring in more product skills, for example. But we were very much living hand to mouth, so it was a small team, and keeping it very tight.
Got it. And how did you get the most out of that group of people? A lot of founders I talk to find their boards are a nightmare. They're sort of dysfunctional, and an increasing number I notice seem to be taking the structure where they isolate them and they deal with them on a one-to-one basis, because when they bring that group dynamic together, they struggle to get the value out of them. How, I mean, by the end, you had a fully sort of functioning board working together. But can you talk a little bit about, how you saw that dynamic evolve and what you learned from that?
Yeah, I mean, it was never going to be tension free. I remember for the first few years, I used to get incredibly frustrated that I had a million jobs to do every day. I was responsible for so much. I had so many plates spinning. I was personally involved in doing so much, and yet at one point I had this bunch of people that wanted to come in and eat croissant and sit around the table for 3 hours, and I was thinking I don't have time for this. It would also drive me nuts that one of our board members, who I love to bits, and he came in later, and it made a huge contribution, and he's a really smart guy, but he would sit on his BlackBerry the whole time, and I'm like, focus. This point's important. Are you with us? Uh, but so yeah, there were always frustrations, but
that sounds like an investor director. Is that an investor director?
It was, yes.
Classic.
There were always frustrations, but ultimately, it was my company and mostly my board that I'd put together. So if anybody was to blame, it was me. But I got what I needed out of them, and like I said, I didn't really know what I needed from a board, but over time I learned, and obviously in hindsight, looking back, I now know precisely what a board is for, what its role should be, how it should best engage, and I don't think we got it too wrong. It might have been by accident, but I think it all kind of fell together quite well.
So talk me through that, because that's often, actually, we often get that question, and you see that amongst especially founders. They don't really understand what the board is for. And I've seen this as an investor, it was always one of the hallmarks of the organizations that outperformed. They'd really figured out how to sort of unlock their boards. But what, in your mind, how do you articulate that to someone, who's starting out in a business?
Yeah, I mean, a board provides lots of different functions, but some of them that I think are more important are, well, first of all, there's a fiduciary duty. The board is there to make sure the company is well run, is law abiding, and is acting in the interests of the shareholders, or if it's a more kind of B Corp type structure, in the interests of all stakeholders. So you need somebody there to measure those things and to check that it's being run in accordance with the principles it was set up by. And they are there to not define, but to guide strategy and to help the company move towards its chosen strategy. You can't impose a strategy on an exec team or a CEO that doesn't want it, but you're there to draw it out of them and to help them get there, and to reflect on what would help them get there faster. And I think the third thing is that, as you probably know, Ollie, it's an incredibly lonely job being a CEO. You are the top of the pyramid in your own organization, and you bear all of the burden of driving the company. If things aren't going well, you're the one that's stressing out about it. You can't say to your team, hey, we might go bust next month. You've got to be positive and action oriented, and bear it and come up with the plan that's going to lead people forward. That's a very, very lonely and stressful job. And it's important that you have support, and the board is there to support the CEO and the exec team generally, and to guide them, to help them think through things rationally. So I think those are the three key things: fiduciary responsibilities, strategy, refinement, and supporting the CEO.
I think, the one thing I might add to that I've certainly always found very valuable is the sort of the networking and the introductions board members can do. You can spend, months trying to break into somewhere, and one call from a board member to someone they know suddenly sort of sends you through, and that's something
Yes.
we've always found very, very valuable. But you touched earlier on, or we touched earlier on the investor directors and the dynamic there. Again, I sort of see lots of founders who sort of get themselves into this position where they've got 20 investor directors sitting around the table, and it's carnage because everyone's trying to prove how smart they are. They've all got sort of slightly different incentives depending on where their fund life cycle is. How do you think now about that dynamic when you come in as a sort of independent director, I suppose, and thinking about that board construction of the investor directors and independent directors?
In PhotoBox, we never had any kind of problem with investor directors. they are aligned with the interests of everybody around the table. They want the company to succeed, they want it to grow, they want it to do well, and they want to support the people to make sure that that has the best chance of happening. However, I have seen on other boards where I've either been an observer or a participant more animosity directed towards investor directors, and it's almost like they're portrayed as the villain around the table, the bad guy that's going to snipe about things. I don't know why that is particularly. I mean, for any director to actively destabilize things would not be a good outcome. But I've seen that happen. I don't really know. I mean, I think if everybody around the table is mature and logical about what needs to happen, there's no reason for investor directors to be treated any differently.
I mean, one of the things, and I know from talking to you, you have this amazing way of thinking about businesses. In the past, I came from an investment background, and sitting on the boards of companies, I often felt like a bit of a fraud because I'd never actually run a team of more than sort of 5 people. And that's one thing I sometimes sort of sense with investor directors is often they haven't actually ever been in a business. And so although they've seen the playbook happen a lot of times, it's quite difficult for them to relate to it and what the sort of the executive team are going through. Do you ever feel that now as an independent director that you're able to bring a different sort of value to the investor directors around the table?
I think so. I think that perspective is really important. It's important to understand how hard and stressful it is to be on the exec side. Particularly, with startups, we choose to do the impossible, or we choose to do something that's certainly very difficult. And if it's a great idea, you're going to be surrounded by competition. If it's a niche idea, people are constantly going to be questioning whether it's going to work at all. It's a very stressful situation, and I think it's important that board members give due consideration to that level of stress, and that it's not easy. And it's all very well for a board to say, well, why don't you just do X? If that's not always that simple. And the other thing is, it's not a kind of zero-sum game. I think also the reason I've seen animosity directed towards investor directors is often you see not even the investor, but an observer on behalf of the investor being sent in, and they're told to be the bad guy, perhaps, and to lay the line down, like, well, when are you going to hit this growth target? And it feels like sometimes, at least from the exec team's perspective, the observer or the investor director is the bad guy because they're trying to ring fence results for themselves. They're trying to make their funds look better, or get their opportunity to sell or whatever, and it's all about them and their investment. I've learned that the best way to help a company to succeed is for everybody to kind of be in it together. If one person around the table is trying to get a particular advantage or serve their own needs, it's very difficult to continue to run the company. It's got to be about recognition that if we support this exec team and allow them to do their best work, then everybody does well.
Right. And what are the characteristics, do you think, of the best boards that you have worked with when they are humming? Are there particular tangible things that you see common to them all, or is it different on different boards?
Well, I think the two most important things from any board members is engagement and insight. I mean, I think it's very, I wouldn't say it's common, but it's a problem if you have board members who are not engaged, who turn up for the board meeting, half listening, haven't read the board packs beforehand, don't take the time and trouble to engage with the exec team, perhaps outside of the boardroom, and say, tell me more about this issue. It's really important to have people engaged. You don't want them to run your company or to be operationally on the hook for it, but you want them to be switched on and really digging into the issues and trying to get a good understanding. And the second thing is insight. It's all very well to have people around the table and engaged, but if they don't ever offer any insight on experience in their past, or, as you said, contacts they could reach out to, or potential ways to solve a challenge, then what value are they? So it's got to be those two things.
Yeah, it's I've seen that so many times as an investor. We used to get these blue chip names coming in. You'd think, wow, and they'd sort of come at 10,000 feet, create chaos with a whole load of questions, disappear, and then come back, 3 months later and the same thing again, and didn't actually have the time to really roll up their sleeves and help out. So that resonates a lot. On the flip side, what do you see most commonly on the bat? I know you've been involved in some, dysfunctional boards, or at least one. What do you see as the sort of hallmarks of those that aren't working?
Well, the thing you're referring to from a previous conversation we had is very early on in my PhotoBox journey, we had one client that was effectively, we offered a kind of white labeled version of our print service through them. They were a camera retailer, and because they were bringing us a lot of new business and they were also growing, we thought it would be a fun and insightful idea to swap non-execs. So I became a non-exec on their board, and their CEO became a non-exec on our board. And about every 6 weeks, I'd go up for board meetings. They were up near Leeds, and I would be on the train on the way up and reading the board pack. And a lot of the things about their financials just didn't make any sense to me. I felt that I understood the basics of e-commerce box shifting, but their numbers seemed to be going in the wrong direction. They seemed to have a falling average order value, falling margins. In some cases, they were selling cameras at a loss. They had a huge growing staff numbers. It just didn't make sense. And I raised this a couple of times, and I got basically told by the board, "Oh, this is fine. It's fine. Like there's lots of logical reasons for this. Average order values falling because cameras are getting cheaper, but every so often a new wave comes out and that pushes it back up again. And yes, we sell cameras at a loss because we have to stay at the top of the price comparison sites. But and yes, we're hiring more and more people, but those people can upsell people on the phone, so it increases margin." So they had a good answer for everything, but I just felt like I don't really mind what the answers are. In the numbers, things look quite bleak, and this went on for about 3-4 months, maybe a little bit longer. And one day I was looking at the numbers, and I was thinking, this company is basically insolvent just by looking at the balance sheet and the way the trading numbers are. Got up to the board meeting, said this, and they agreed, and it was a very short board meeting. And I think my lesson from that was that in my naivety, I was happy to be fobbed off by them that things were okay, but in fact things were really bad, and I should have made my point far more forcefully. And as a non-exec, you bear, that goes on your record. You're part of a company that's become insolvent. So I think that's one form of deficiency in a board, that they kind of end up with this groupthink that everything's all right, but sometimes it isn't. And I think boards are not just there to kind of rubber stamp what is assumed to be a well-functioning exec team. Sometimes boards are there to step in when things go horribly wrong, and we all have to recognize the signals of that and step up when it happens.
Yeah, and it's a really tough one to do, to sort of strike that balance where there's respect and psychological safety around the table, but also that people are willing to, I think someone recently put it, disagree agreeably. What are the things that you've seen work well to sort of foster that sort of environment? Are there specific things that you look to encourage on the boards that you work with in order to sort of build those relationships? You talked a little bit earlier about what happens outside of the boardroom.
Yeah, I think it's like any work relationship. It's got to be based on trust, mutual respect. I feel like I've got through my career by being a nice guy at work. I've had to fire people at times, but I've never thrown things at people or had blazing rows with them. Or I feel like there are ways to get what you need, what you want, and what you need by explaining to people why it's important to do this, and and when you have disagreements, understanding their perspective on it. And I think it's the same in the dynamic between the board and the exec team. It's got to be based on an understanding of that other person's point of view, which may well be valid. It's rare that anything is ever black and white. There's normally an element of truth and valid perspective on both sides, and it's finding that middle ground and but explaining why you feel it's important to look at an alternative or go a different route, and build a good working relationship.
Okay. And we haven't really touched on, interestingly, you haven't mentioned the sort of the role of the chair at all. What's your experience of that role? It's one that people often struggle with, like to understand, its importance or not. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Both based on your sort of experience as a founder, but also as a board member and chair yourself.
So, well, it's interesting. I've never actually taken on the chairperson role, and I should probably do it at some point, but I've kind of shied away from it. I actually bought, I can't remember the name of it, but I bought a book, like a New York Times bestseller that is meant to be the Bible of what it is to be an effective chairperson. And I keep meaning to read it, and I haven't read it yet. I think over the years, because I've seen so many boards and worked with so many high growth companies, I've got a good sense of what good board performance looks like, what a good board member performance looks like, and what the mechanics of a healthy board are. So I guess informally, I kind of act as a chair sometimes, particularly with companies that are failing to execute their strategy effectively, haven't really used a board properly. I'm dealing with one of my clients at the moment. Is struggling has a great product, but is struggling to achieve the growth that they're capable of. And it was only a few months ago I started asking, what guidance are you getting from your board? And now I'm invited to their board as an observer. And it's not that it was failing as a board. It's just it was too passive, and they weren't providing the mechanisms and guidance and ambition that the company needed. So I've kind of stepped in and have defined a playbook for being an effective board. So you could argue that I'm effectively pretending to be the chair, but I think it's an important role. It just has to be somebody that's really experienced, that understands what good and bad boards look like, and is willing to take responsibility to guide the exec team and the other board members on what is acceptable performance.
Can you talk maybe a bit more about that playbook that you've given? What does that actually look like tangibly?
Well, some of it's very boring, process-based stuff. Like on boards that I'm involved in, I really insist on having a board pack that goes out 3 days before the board meeting that includes operational updates from each of the key departments. I want those updates to be less than 2 sides of A4 or less than 4 slides if it's in PowerPoint form. It has to be in PDF. Like, it's ridiculous how many quirky formats get sent out, and then if you're on a train on an iPad or something, you can't read it. So simple things like that. Getting the diary dates booked, making sure there's enough time allocated for the board meeting. I've been at way too many where we're still 2/3 of the way through the agenda and the time is due to run out, and then everybody says, "Can you stay another hour?" And people say, "Well, I've got another meeting." It's like the basics are really important, but more meaningfully, I guess, you have to have an exec team that has been given clear guidance on what's important by the board. You have to have strategic goals set, whether that's in the form of OKRs or a value creation plan. And you have to have an exec team that's able to follow through operationally and make sure that each of their departments or teams are contributing to that those strategic outcomes. So there's a lot there, and obviously there's things about minutes and actions and what happens outside of the boardroom. But I I tend to follow the same process in all boards I work with.
Yeah, I think you're so right, and I think you played that down as sort of administrative process, but it makes such a difference when you've got proper papers that have been written in advance with options clearly laid out that then allow the discussion to really focus around the meat, rather than in a number of boards where you go and they spend the whole time updating and sort of distracting, and you never actually get into the critical issues.
And that's really one key issue, which is whenever I'm asking the CEO or other senior people to submit their information beforehand, the report, I want them to be very clear what is for information, what is for discussion, and what is for decision, because I want all board members to come into the boardroom and have already read all the materials and very clearly understand what can be skimmed over because it's a quick operational update, but what are the things that we're actually here to discuss and what are we here to decide on. Because otherwise, I see a common problem. My son actually is on the board of a theatre, and they tend to get distracted by operational issues, which shouldn't be anything to do with the board, and then they run out of time to discuss the important strategic points. So that's a common issue as well, and I've never been afraid, or certainly in recent years, to interrupt somebody and say, I get what you're saying, but this is not not the right forum to discuss this point, or we have to move on because this is not the most pressing issue right now, and make sure that we keep guiding the conversation towards the key points.
Yeah, no, that resonates well. In terms of, you touched a little bit there on sort of OKRs and setting the strategy. I've just been reading a great book, actually, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, which is a sort of a classic. And was slightly sort of terrified reading through it, all the hallmarks of a bad strategy, and thinking, yep, tick, 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 we've got all of those. And the sort of the simplicity of a good strategy being one that's sort of easily understandable by everyone, and being very clear about why will you win, and gave some sort of great examples that really brought that to life. But then also, what are the guiding actions that sort of follow through on that? That seems to be an area that so many organizations going through this scale up growth really struggle with, between that kind of high level, what's the sort of vision, mission, why are you going to win, and then actually implementing and executing on it. And you sort of see people going through sort of OKRs and then finding actually OKRs are too prescriptive. Then sort of quite a few of them seem to be using the 4 disciplines of execution at the moment, where they've got key wars defined, and then the battles that they need to win those wars, and then leaving it to the teams to figure out what are the skirmishes they need to win those battles. But it seems an ongoing thing that people are wrestling with. How do you sort of manage that, and what have you seen working most effectively with that sort of communication from sort of strategy set at the board, and really wrestling with the differentiation and making sure that is flowing through into the execution?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of different frameworks out there, and it doesn't really matter which one you use. I've worked with people that are using OKRs more than anything, but value creation plans potentially at the more mature, larger stage of company growth, where they end up executing more complex projects. I've seen companies that just use KPIs to track what they're doing, but for me, it all starts with there has to be an expression of the business model that makes sense and is working before you can really start to think about strategic growth. So at the simplest level, you mentioned, vision and mission. The company has to know and be able to articulate why it exists. What's the problem what's the improvement it's trying to make in the world that justifies its existence? And based on that, that vision or mission and some kind of North Star metric of measuring, that impact they're having, there has to be a product or service the company is delivering, potentially multiple products or services, but for each one, there are 3 key elements. They have to understand who is their customer. Is that customer experiencing a pain or a problem that isn't being well served currently, that this product can serve? There has to be a commercial model, people that are willing to pay money that covers the cost of providing the service, but also generates enough excess margin to power the company's growth in the future and allow them to do R&D. And thirdly, there has to be a kind of platform or process structure that the company can build to deliver that service. It's no good saying, I found customers who want flying cars and they're willing to pay a lot of money for flying cars, but I can't build flying cars. It has to be those three things together: customer, commercial model, and platform or tech solution. If those three things are balanced, then you have product market fit. You have a product or service that can fit well with the market you're targeting. That has to be the starting point for any successful business. If you haven't got a business model that delivers those things, even a tiny one, then you don't really have anything that's generating value and you can't grow. So that's the first thing. You've got to have that in place. I think once you've got that in place, you can then say, well, how are we going to grow? Are we going to grow? So, for example, with PhotoBox, we got to a point where we had a really great, successful service, but we needed to achieve organic growth, and we identified several areas. One was geographic expansion. We launched into new countries, we could grow the business. The second was if we launch new product verticals, like move into new areas like wall decor, photo books, jewelry, things like that, cards and invitations. Those were new product categories that would allow us access to more people, more revenue. There was the shift to mobile. That was a big thing for us. We needed to provide services that people could order in their hand. And there were customer service enhancements. Like if we made it faster to produce an order and faster to deliver, then that had benefits as well. So we ended up with four areas for growth. Businesses typically, have other things that they can use to grow, and you need a strategic plan around that growth. And I've worked with companies that just don't know where to start with OKRs, but it's always possible to have a kind of framework of basic OKRs that get them progressing well in their first year, and then see where you go from there.
And how do you think about that balance? Because again, one of the things I often see companies wrestling with going through that great growth stage is balancing focus. And as an investor, I would always be preaching the mantra of focus, 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 and the irony is now not lost on me that we're sort of spreading ourselves too thinly as a business. But how do you as a board member, when you're thinking about what's the right balance between having enough diversity of initiatives that you've got different irons in the fire versus ending up with a sort of diversification scenario where you're just spread too thinly? How are you making that assessment when you're sort of thinking about it as a board member?
I think if an exec team comes to me, and actually it happened twice in the last 2 weeks, where somebody's come to me with, I'll use one example. Somebody came to me a couple of days ago. We had a meeting, and they were presenting their plan for this year, and it consisted of 5 high-level initiatives and 25 individual outcomes that they were trying to achieve. And I said, it's a great plan. It's really ambitious. I can see why everything is on this sheet, but it's just way too ambitious. There's no way with a relatively small team you're going to achieve all of these things. So I went back to them and said, let's cut it down. I mean, I talked about a kind of OKR framework. In general, I think OKR should be about impact, quality, and laying the foundations for future growth. And so I got her to categorize these top level initiatives into one of those 3 categories, and then said also, if you assume that only 2 out of each of the bullet points for each one you could secure for this year, and everything else is on a best efforts basis, what would you do? So it was all about focus and prioritization, effectively. And another client I've been working with has shown me 10 major initiatives they're working on this year. I challenged that. To be fair, they demonstrated that 5 of them are going to close quite quickly, and then they can focus on the remaining 5. So that's a fair response. But yeah, focus is really important.
Actually, it was a great question that actually is in that sort of good strategy, bad strategy, where one of the questions in the case studies they were looking at was, if you assume that the business will fail if you do not achieve these things in 18 months, what will you do differently? And that's a sort of a great kind of, I think it's so easy when we're sort of caught up in the day to day to be just not really having to make those choices. But once you start thinking about it in those stark terms, I found that very helpful, because often I think I probably cheat myself in my own thinking and think, oh well, if it takes 24 months, that's okay. Whereas once you have that, the business is going to fail. It does change the way you think about it. You touched on earlier your own experience with PhotoBox and that kind of feeling retrospectively that you could have gone faster if you had, rather than just sort of tootling along as a perfectly sort of adequate business, actually could have been more aggressive. If you were going back in time as the sort of board member then, how would you be framing that decision and thinking about it? What do you think was missed?
I think if a board member had come and talked to me a year into the project and said, look, things are going quite well, but they're going very slowly still. And so if a board member had come to me a year in and said, things are going well, but they could be going a lot faster, and I think you should think about ways in which you can accelerate the growth of this business, whether that's by taking more risk, taking on more funding, going to talk to VCs. I think that would have been a really good piece of advice, and we never got it at the time. We just carried on growing organically. And to be fair, we grew well at the point where I raised money from VCs, which was 6 years into the business. We'd got to about 3 million of turnover, which is not a bad number. But we could have probably done that in 3 years if I'd raised money 1 year in. So it's I wish I'd had the advice. I wish I'd thought of it myself, but I didn't at the time.
Okay, and but obviously, I mean, I almost see the opposite problem for a lot of founders now. There's various sort of WhatsApp groups with founders, and we've self-funded the business today. It's grown it through cash flows. And most founders, when they say that, is, my gosh, my next business is going to be self-funded. I don't care how slowly it's going to go. It's going to be self-funded, because the pain and the pressure of that sort of accelerated growth often sort of forces us to do things that just aren't right for the long term of the business. And actually, I've been so badly diluted by the new investors coming in, and it's become like a drug. It accelerates the path we're on. It reduces our ability to course correct. How would you think about that from the other side? Again, I guess it goes back to the sort of the framework. There are positives and negatives, surely.
I suppose there's a spectrum of investors. There are good investors and less good investors. We were very lucky to have people who were supportive, patient, and because we had a business that was growing well and succeeding in its goals, yes, we suffered dilution, but never to the detriment of the founders. So you have to pick your investors well and raise money from a position of strength, not a position of weakness. Don't leave it to the point where it's too late. Raise money when you have good news, and it's a good starting point for the next phase of growth. There will always be ups and downs, and we've had periods where things have gone not at all well, but that's not a good time to go out and raise money for sure. So I think it's about timing and not accepting money from the first person that says yes. You've got to pick and choose and make sure you've got a good dynamic and a good level of trust with the investor.
And how do you go about that? Again, I mean, you've been through that as a founder, and now I guess a lot of the companies that you work with be going through that, and often it's such a mad rush. You're still trying to run the business, and then all your key people are spending all their time on the fundraising, that all the things that if you sat down and thought about it sensibly you would do can often go out the window in terms of sort of assessing those people. So when you're kind of working with organizations now thinking about that, how do you advise them to assess those investors?
I think fundraising is a strategic activity. It deserves to be on the strategic plan. It needs time allocated from the exec team, and there's an opportunity cost if you do that. You're not doing some other things. You need to be planning for fundraising. You need to be talking to the market. You need to be allocating time to go and meet investors. So it's not something you do all of a sudden. It's normally a process that you've built up over time, and you've built relationships in the market. You've been sending out teaser information to say, hey, we're this is going on with our company, and if you ever want to have a coffee. I was lucky in that because I had a co-founder, Mark, and in many ways he was much more kind of strategic and corporate in his thinking. He recognized early on that, or certainly from the point where we said, okay, we're going to go through this phase of raising money, he started reaching out to advisors and boutique banks and brokers to say, well, what are our options for raising money? And so I think, we did our homework and we built up those relationships. And when we did end up executing, we knew we were making good, solid decisions.
Were there any sort of, when you look back at it in hindsight, were there any sort of mistakes that could easily have been avoided?
Well, my journey is a catalogue of massive mistakes, but luckily we survived them all. I mean, I could tell you. So, for example, when we decided 5 years in that we needed to kind of go big or go home, our original plan was we need to raise a lot of money. Well, we need to raise money, and we need to be present in Europe. That was it. The two parts of the strategy were raise and expand into Europe. And we figured the best way to do that, actually, there were lots of options for those two, but the one that we landed on was we were going to do a small AIM listing to raise the money. And we were going to go and acquire a small European company that already had a presence in Europe. And we started out down that path. We found good investors for the AIM listing. We had a nomad hired. That was all kind of on track. And then we found this small Swiss company to acquire that was 7 people, but they were operating in 12 countries. And we agreed a deal in principle with them, had a term sheet, flew over to Geneva to go and do due diligence, which I was doing myself because, save money. And I think on the first day, I discovered, diving into their database to kind of verify the number of customers and number of orders and all this sort of stuff. There was their VAT column in the database was 0 all the way down. And I'm like, how come you don't charge any VAT? And they said, well, we're Swiss. And I said, but you're like, operating all across Europe, and you've got German customers and you're printing in Germany, right? And they said, yes. And I said, so I'm pretty sure there should be VAT there. And they said, no, it's fine. And we went out to dinner that night. And I remember speaking to their chairman and saying, I'm really concerned about this VAT thing. And the next day, they brought me this big file of kind of expert advice on their VAT status. And I read it. It said, you're doing everything wrong. You should be charging VAT. So the deal collapsed. And we were left a bit high and dry because we had this AIM listing ready to go and nobody to acquire. And that was one example where, it felt like our plans were crashing down and we had to make quick decisions. And we ended up phoning our nearest competitor in France and saying, let's put the two companies together. And after a bit of back and forth, they agreed and we did that. So it was definitely a plan B, but you have to adapt when things don't go your way.
Wow, what a good advert for doing your own due diligence. I mean, that's an amazing story. Graham, I could keep asking and talking to you for forever. It's been absolutely fascinating, but I need to wrap up now with a quick 5-question quickfire, if that's all right.
Sure, go ahead.
So, one book that every board member should read.
I'll tell you what, the two that come to mind are I absolutely loved Shoe Dog, about Phil Knight, who created Nike. It's just an amazing story of entrepreneurship and overcoming challenges and growing an amazing large company and the mindset of an entrepreneur. So I think that's one. It just I recognize so much of that, and I loved it because it's all about running and Japan, and there's a lot in there that I found it fascinating. But that's a great book. And one other book that I read that comes to mind is Matthew Syed, Rebel Ideas, which is all about diversity in all forms, contributing to a much rounder um, view of any problem to be solved and creative ways to solve that problem. I found that fascinating as well.
We didn't touch on diversity at all, and I shouldn't get sidetracked. But how has that played into your experience? That concept that Matthew Side talks about in boards, because obviously that's a sort of hot topic at the moment. But it's something that startups or earlier stage scale ups, investor backed companies, in our experience and what we see coming through the platform, tend to be less focused on that than the listed companies, than government backed organisations, and the charities who are regulated.
Well, what I'll say is at the beginning of PhotoBox, I was my customer, right? I built PhotoBox for mid-30s tech geeks who wanted to print digital photos, and the website looked like it was built for 30-year-old white men who had digital cameras. Um, and and then somewhere about 10 years later, somebody told me, my new CEO, as part of our evolution, we brought in a much more experienced CEO. He said to me, you're not your customer anymore, right? Your customer is, a lady with two kids who's the memory keeper of the house, and you're talking about this tech bullshit that's not relevant to her life at all. Um, and so there's a recognition that often you're not your customer, and you need the people who are your customers to be represented either within the company or within the board or whatever, to give that perspective. But more generally, um, to have a board that's composed of only men or only white people or only a certain age group is a very limited view of your company and its role in the world. And I think the more different viewpoints you get, the better your board becomes, the more effective it becomes at solving problems, at helping you to grow. I'm a huge believer in that.
Yeah, he talks about that, the 9/11 failing to spot, because it was all WASP
The
in the
CIA was
CIA.
made up of, yeah, white men who didn't appreciate that someone would be willing to die for their
Yeah.
cause, and so were blindsided by suicide bombers.
I thought that was really powerful, and we do see that on the platform. More and more sort of chairs are suddenly sort of waking up to the value of having a millennial on their board, when the average age around the table is sort of 60s, and they sort of suddenly realize, well, 80% of our stakeholders are millennials, and we just haven't got that perspective around the table. I'm doing a dreadful job of sticking to my 5-question quickfire. Your favorite quote?
I guess the kind of ancient, probably misquoted Chinese proverb of that doesn't kill us makes us stronger is it's got to be the mantra for all entrepreneurs.
Absolutely, there's two shall pass. Your favorite restaurant?
Don't have a favorite restaurant. Love eating out. Obviously, that's been massively curtailed over the last couple of years. Just like experiencing new restaurants, trying new things. I do love Asian food, Japanese food. I'm watching a program with Stanley Tucci doing a tour of Italy at the moment and just eating the most amazing Italian food. So that makes me want to go back to an Italian restaurant. But no particular favorite.
Okay, favorite holiday?
I'm terrible at planning holidays. My wife is amazing at it. She will research things and plan amazing trips with amazing itineraries. And I almost feel like I turn up at the airport and say, "Where are we going?" I can't remember. But once I'm there, I really enjoy it. I think the one that I did plan was after I left PhotoBox in 2017. I planned for myself and my family to go to Japan for 3 weeks, because I'd worked there in the 1990s when I worked for Union Bank of Switzerland. And it was a hard slog. I was always jet lagged. I was spending, a few weeks in Tokyo, never got outside of Tokyo, never acted as a tourist. And I wanted to go back there and be a tourist. And so that was a great trip.
Fantastic. And last but not least, your favorite app?
Oh, my phone is a workhorse, and it's there to just help me survive each day, get through life efficiently. Um, I don't have any apps that I kind of love using, but my home screen's filled with utility apps that make life possible, whether it's Uber or to-do lists or calendar or email, and City Mapper when we used to be out and about a lot. That was a great app. But yeah, whatever I need to get me through the day, that's what I use.
Amazing. Graham, thank you so much. It's been an absolute privilege. It's such a treat to hear from someone who has both the perspective of having built a business themselves and also sat on the other side of the table as a board member. As I said, I could keep talking to you for hours, but this has been fantastic. Thank you, and great to see you.
My pleasure.